The first crack in my marriage didn't come with shouting, slammed doors. It came with expensive wine, perfectly roasted chicken, and the kind of polite laughter people use when they're hiding something from the one person at the table who isn't supposed to know. We'd been married a few years, long enough to build routines, short enough that friends still called us solid, like we were a well-constructed bridge no one had tested yet. No dramatic fights, no broken plates, just distance. The quiet kind. The kind that sneaks in slowly until one day you realize you're living beside someone instead of with them. Patricia had become efficient. Bills paid on time, groceries always stocked, texts answered with military precision. But the small things were disappearing, less eye contact, less laughter that belonged only to us. More, did you send that email? And less, how was your day? Nothing you could point at in court, just enough to feel cold. So when her parents invited us to dinner, I expected the usual performance. Wine, polite conversation, her mother's gentle judgment disguised as concern, and her father quietly wishing he were somewhere else. They lived in one of those houses that always looks ready for a magazine photo. Not fancy, controlled. Like even the air had been approved in advance. Her mother, Diane, opened the door with a smile perfectly calibrated for social situations. "Hi, there you are," she said, kissing Patricia's cheek before turning to me. "Hello." Not cold, just minimal. Like a receptionist who knows your appointment might get canceled. "Diane," I said, smiling politely. Years of practice. Her father, Richard, appeared behind her holding a bottle of wine like emotional support. "Hey, good to see you," he said. His eyes disagreed. I noticed. I just didn't know why yet. Dinner began the way these dinners always do. Compliments about the smell of the food. Diane explaining herbs like she was narrating a documentary. Candles lit because overhead lighting is apparently a moral failure. We sat. Wine poured. Plates served. Patricia looked perfect. Posture straight. Smile ready. She touched my arm once, briefly, like checking I was still physically there. Then the micro-signals started. She laughed without looking at me. Richard avoided my gaze. Diane asked questions that sounded normal but felt loaded. "So," Diane said lightly, cutting her chicken, "how are you two doing, really?" "We're good," Patricia answered too quickly. I raised my glass. Alive, employed, and only mildly disappointed in modern parking enforcement. Diane smiled politely. Humor wasn't her favorite language. "Stability is important," she said. Patricia checked her phone under the table. Quick glance, small glow, private world. I could have asked who she was texting. I didn't. Desperate men interrogate. Calm men observe. Diane started talking about a neighbor's divorce like it was a cautionary tale. "Some people ignore the signs," she said. "They choose the wrong partner because they want the story to work." Patricia hummed softly. Didn't look at me. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe I was just tired. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Excuse me," I said. "Quick call." Diane waved politely. Patricia didn't even ask who it was. The call was nothing. Wrong number. Someone selling insurance for a life I wasn't sure I still had. I ended it and walked back toward the dining room. And then I heard Diane's voice, lowered just enough to be kind and cruel at the same time. "He's still not the best option," she said quietly. I stopped in the hallway. "You have a better candidate," she continued. "Someone who can give you more. More security. More everything." Silence followed. Patricia didn't laugh, didn't argue, didn't say, "He's my husband." She said nothing. Silence can be very loud when someone refuses to defend you. Richard cleared his throat softly, like a man hoping to disappear. "You don't have to settle," Diane added gently. "You're still young." A pause. Then Patricia spoke, barely above a whisper. "I know." 2 words, calm, certain, enough. Something inside me didn't shatter. It just locked into place. There's a moment when confusion ends, not because you know everything, but because you know enough. I waited a second, let my face settle, then walked back in. "Sorry," I said lightly. "Telemarketers, society's real villains." Diane laughed like nothing had happened. Patricia stared at her plate. Richard studied his wine like it contained escape instructions. I sat down and kept eating. Because when someone is showing you who they are, the smart move is to let the scene finish. A few minutes later, Diane leaned back and said casually, "Not every man is built for real responsibility." A small pause. A quiet chuckle from Richard. No reaction from Patricia. That was the second betrayal. The first was the sentence. The second was her silence. I took a sip of wine and smiled. "True," I said calmly. "Some men can't even load a dishwasher. Tragic." Diane's smile tightened. She preferred control to humor. I finished dinner, thanked them politely, played my role perfectly. On the drive home, Patricia scrolled through her phone, city lights moving across her face like she already belonged somewhere else. Silence filled the car. "My mom can be intense," she said finally. "Yeah," I replied. "She's got the subtlety of a billboard." Almost a smile. Then back to the phone. I kept my eyes on the road, thinking one quiet thought. If there's a better candidate, there's an audition. And auditions always leave evidence. So I didn't ask questions that night, didn't accuse, didn't beg. I kissed her forehead, said goodnight, and lay in the dark like everything was normal. But something had changed, quietly, completely. Because when someone decides you're not the best option, your job isn't to convince them. Your job is to remember where the exit is. The next morning looked perfectly normal, which, in my experience, is exactly how abnormal things prefer to begin. Patricia was already in the kitchen when I walked in, coffee machine humming softly, sunlight coming through the blinds in thin, careful lines, her phone resting in her hand at that familiar angle, not hidden, just private. "Morning," she said. "Morning." Same tone we'd used for years, warm enough to sound married, neutral enough to survive silence. I poured coffee and leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise like it might form words if I stared long enough. She moved around the kitchen efficiently. Toast, mug, bag, phone check. Everything timed, everything precise. Lately, that's what she'd become, precise. No wasted motion, no random hugs, no standing too close for no reason, just a person completing tasks in the same room as me. "Busy day?" I asked. "Meetings all afternoon," she said. "Might run late?" Of course it might. Late meetings are the national anthem of modern distance. "Try not to accidentally become CEO," I said. "Too much paperwork." A polite half-smile, the kind you give a coworker who isn't funny enough to offend. Then she checked her phone again. Quick glance, thumb movement, screen dark. I didn't look. Not because I'm noble, because timing matters. Truth, if it's real, doesn't need to be chased. It walks toward you eventually, usually carrying evidence. The day passed in pieces. Emails, meetings that could have been messages, conversations about things nobody would remember tomorrow. Normal life. The great distraction machine. Around 6 in the evening, my phone buzzed on the desk. "Patricia." I opened the message. "Meeting's running late. I might stop by Emma's after. Haven't seen her in forever." Emma. Reliable, friendly, conveniently existing in every suspicious situation in human history. I stared at the text for a second longer than necessary. Not because it was shocking, because it was smooth, prepared, like a sentence that had been written before the day even started. I typed back, "Sure. Say hi for me." Simple, supportive. The behavior of a husband who definitely isn't sitting inside a slow, emotional autopsy. 3 dots appeared, stayed, disappeared. No reply. Conversation complete, alibi established, scene set. I put the phone down and went back to work. Or at least I looked like I did. 10 minutes later, another vibration. Different notification from our shared delivery account. We'd never separated it. Groceries, takeout, late-night bad decisions, all ordered under one peaceful, trusting login. Digital marriage, convenient and fragile. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the address. Not our home, not Emma's place. I knew Emma's street by heart, not anywhere even slightly familiar. Order for two, pasta, salad, wine. Nothing dramatic. Nothing suspicious if you didn't know where to look. Just dinner. My thumb hovered over the screen. And here's the strange part. I didn't feel panic. No racing heartbeat. No cinematic shock. No internal screaming. Just stillness. Because some part of me had already been expecting this. Like hearing thunder after you've watched the sky darken all day. I locked the phone and placed it face down on the desk. A coworker leaned over my cubicle wall. "Hey, did you send that report?" "Yeah," I said calmly, "unless I hallucinated productivity." He laughed, walked away. Crisis of the century successfully hidden behind office humor. The apartment was quiet when I got home. I tossed my keys on the counter and stood there for a second, listening to nothing. Then I opened the fridge and started putting together a late, unnecessary dinner. Like routine might still mean something. The world kept moving somewhere outside, but inside the kitchen it felt paused, waiting for me to catch up to what I already knew. And in the middle of all that normal life, my marriage quietly shifted into past tense. At 9:12 p.m., my phone buzzed again. I already knew it was her before I looked. "I'm gonna stay at Emma's tonight. It's late and I don't feel like driving back. Clean, reasonable, almost responsible. If lies had resumes, this one would look very professional." I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand, because understanding something too quickly feels dangerous. Dinner for two, wrong address. Now a sleepover. The math wasn't complicated. I typed slowly. Okay. 3 dots appeared almost immediately this time. Night, kisses, a heart, small, red, efficient. Amazing how a single emoji can try to cover an entire betrayal, like putting a sticker over a crack in the wall and calling it renovation. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. Still no anger. And that was the part that surprised me most. I'd always assumed this kind of moment would feel explosive, like shouting or breaking something expensive. Instead, it felt quiet, clear, like standing in a room where the lights had finally turned on after months of dim guessing. Because once you see the truth, even a little of it, you stop arguing with shadows. I woke up before my alarm, the way you do when your brain decides sleep is a luxury you no longer deserve. For a few seconds, I just stared at the ceiling, waiting for my body to catch up to what my mind already knew. No dramatic montage, no sudden rage. Just that quiet, stale awareness sitting on my chest like an unpaid bill. Patricia's side of the bed was untouched. The sheet was smooth, like she'd never been there at all. It should have felt peaceful. Extra space, extra quiet. Instead, it felt like a hotel room pretending to be a home. Like the place itself was holding its breath. I rolled out of bed and padded into the kitchen. The apartment was silent in the specific way it gets when you live with someone who isn't actually there. The fridge hummed. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Life doing what it always does. I made coffee I didn't really want. The mug warmed my hands. The taste didn't matter. My phone was on the counter where I'd left it. No new messages. I stared at the screen for a moment and felt something almost like amusement. Not because any of this was funny, because the audacity was. A whole marriage hanging by a thread, and she couldn't even bother with the "I'm alive" text. Like I was a customer support ticket she'd forget to close. I opened the delivery receipt again. Same address, same order, same calm little list of items. Like this was the most ordinary thing in the world. I stood there, coffee cooling, thinking about all the ways I could handle this. I could call her, demand answers, start a fight, be the guy who yells into a phone at 8 in the morning while the neighbors pretend not to hear. I could do the other classic move, go into detective mode, track her location, break into her phone, become a full-time unpaid intern for my own misery. Or I could do the only thing that made sense, I could go to the address, not to cause a scene, not to bang on doors like a lunatic, just to see. Because if I was wrong, I wanted to know quickly. And if I was right, I wanted to know cleanly. Truth hurts either way, but at least it stops the guessing. I set the mug down, grabbed my keys, and left. I drove without music. No news, no podcast, no noise. Silence is uncomfortable when you're trying not to think. When you are thinking, it's perfect. The city looked normal. People walking dogs like they didn't have a care in the world. Someone jogging with that aggressive optimism I've always found suspicious. Cars inching through intersections. Coffee shops opening. The world continuing to exist, completely uninterested in my personal crisis. I followed the GPS like I was going to an appointment. And that's what it felt like, honestly. An appointment with reality. The address was a residential building in a quiet part of town. Not fancy, not a dump. Just one of those blocks you forget immediately after you leave it. Betrayal's favorite aesthetic. Boring. I pulled up, parked half a block away, and turned off the engine. And here it was, the stupidest part. For a second, I actually hoped it was a mistake, that someone else used our account, that the delivery app glitched, that I was about to feel like a paranoid idiot. I would have taken that outcome with a smile. I'd have apologized to myself, bought a coffee, and gone to work like a man who still believed in his own marriage. Hope is a loyal idiot. It sticks around long after it should have been fired. I checked the building number again. Matched. Of course it did. I sat there, hands on the steering wheel, watching the entrance. I didn't know what I expected. A sign? A confession? Patricia stepping outside wearing a giant "I'm lying" t-shirt? Nothing happened. 5 minutes. Maybe 10. Time does this weird thing when you're waiting for proof. It slows down as if it wants you to suffer politely. I forced myself to get out of the car. Not because I was nervous, because staying in there made it feel like I was hiding from my own decision. On the corner was a little convenience store. I walked in like a normal guy who definitely wasn't about to confirm his marriage was dead. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. There was a rack of snacks nobody needed and a fridge full of drinks nobody should have for breakfast. A man behind the counter glanced up from his phone. I grabbed a bottle of water I didn't want because walking in with empty hands feels suspicious. Apparently I was worried about looking suspicious while I was literally doing surveillance on my wife. The human brain is a masterpiece. I set the water on the counter. The cashier looked at me again, mild curiosity. "You live around here?" he asked. "Not really," I said, casual. "Just in the area." I paid, thanked him, and walked back outside with my water bottle like I was a responsible adult who hydrates, not a guy gathering evidence for the emotional trial of the century. Back on the sidewalk, I stopped for a second and looked at the building again. Still boring, still quiet, still pretending to be innocent. I leaned against my car, not even trying to hide, and I waited. Minutes passed. My phone didn't buzz, no messages, no kisses this morning, just silence. Then the entrance door opened, and Patricia stepped out. My brain did that strange thing where everything becomes sharper, like the world quietly zooms in without asking. She looked relaxed, not tired from a late meeting relaxed, more like I slept fine because I wasn't at home relaxed. Her hair was a little different, not messy, styled in a casual way that still took effort. She was dressed like she knew someone would see her. That tiny detail hit me harder than it should have, because it wasn't just the lie, it was the preparation. She glanced down at her phone, smiled at something, and stepped aside. A man came out behind her, not a cartoon villain, not some leather jacket stereotype, just a guy, normal clothes, normal face, the kind of man you could pass in a grocery store and never remember. And honestly, that made it worse, because it meant this wasn't some wild, impulsive disaster. It was domestic. They didn't kiss. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. They stood too close. There's a distance married people keep with strangers. There's another distance they keep with friends. This was neither. They exchanged a few words. She laughed. Quiet, easy. The kind of laugh I hadn't heard at home in months. Then she leaned slightly toward him as she spoke, like her body had already voted on who it wanted to be near. I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't move. No impulse to storm over, no urge to shout her name. I'm not built for public humiliation. I don't do scenes. Scenes are for people who still think the other person cares. I watched, calm as a man watching the end credits of a movie he didn't enjoy. Patricia turned, walked toward her car, and the guy followed her to the sidewalk. They paused by the driver's door. Another quick exchange, something too quiet to hear. Then she got in. She drove away. And she didn't look around once. Why would she? As far as she knew, she was still controlling the story. She'd invented Emma. She'd sent kisses. She'd probably slept great. I stood there for a moment after her car disappeared, staring at the building like it might explain itself. I got back into my car, set the water bottle in the cup holder, and sat with both hands on the wheel. I was about to pull out when I saw someone in the side mirror walking toward me from the sidewalk. At first I didn't pay attention. Then I recognized him. Mark. Not a best friend, not a stranger, just one of those guys who exists in the same circle of barbecues, casual birthdays, and conversations about work that nobody really enjoys, but everyone politely survives. He slowed down when he reached the car, clearly surprised. "Hey, what are you doing here?" he asked, leaning slightly toward the open window. His tone wasn't suspicious, just confused in a normal, everyday way. "Just in the area," I said. Even to me, it sounded like the kind of answer people give when the truth is standing right behind them. Mark nodded slowly, like he wasn't sure whether to believe it but didn't want to push. "Gotcha," he said. "Yeah, I only asked because I see this building every day walking the dog. Quiet place." A small pause settled between us. Not heavy yet. Just waiting. Then he glanced toward the parking spaces, thinking out loud more than asking anything. "Funny thing," he added casually, "I feel like I've seen Patricia's car here a lot lately." The words were light, almost careless, which made them land harder. I kept my hands resting on the wheel and looked straight ahead for a second before answering. "Yeah?" I said quietly. "Yeah," Mark continued, still in that normal conversational tone. "Dark sedan, right?" I kept thinking. That looks familiar. He hesitated, then asked the question the way people do when they're trying to sound polite and accidentally sound honest instead. "Does she have something here? Like work or relatives or something?" There it was. No accusation, no drama, just simple curiosity, the kind that doesn't realize it's holding a knife. For a moment I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the situation had moved past the point where emotions made sense. "Yeah," I said finally, letting out a slow breath. "Something like that." Mark watched my face for half a second longer than comfortable, and in that tiny silence, he understood. You could actually see it happen, that quiet shift when a person realizes the conversation isn't normal anymore. "Oh," he said softly. Just that. One word. No follow-up question. No fake reassurance. Because sometimes adults recognize pain and choose not to step on it. I gave a small shrug that felt heavier than it should have. "Guess she's been busy," I added. The understatement hung in the air between us like something fragile neither of us wanted to touch. Mark looked down at the pavement, then back at me. "Man, I didn't know," he said. "I wouldn't have said anything if I—" "It's okay," I cut in gently. "Really, better to know than keep guessing." Another quiet pause. He nodded slowly, still not sure what the right response was, because there isn't one in moments like this. "Yeah," he said. "I guess so." Finally, Mark stepped back a little. "Take care of yourself, all right?" he said. "I will," I answered. Probably should have started doing that sooner. He gave a small, sad nod, then turned and kept walking down the sidewalk like nothing important had just happened. I started the engine and drove home. The city looked the same as it always did. Same streets, same lights, same people buying coffee and pretending their lives were simple. Mine wasn't simple anymore, but it was clear. And clarity, once you have it, is a kind of freedom, even when it hurts. When I got home, Patricia was already there. She was sitting on the couch with her phone in her hand, legs tucked slightly under her, like any ordinary evening had unfolded exactly as planned. For a moment, I just stood in the doorway and looked at her, trying to understand how something could feel so familiar and so distant at the same time. She noticed me watching. "You're home early," she said, her voice careful but calm. "Everything okay?" "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. I was hoping we could talk for a minute. That changed something in her posture. Not dramatically, just enough to show she understood this wasn't a casual conversation. "Okay," she said slowly, setting her phone aside. "What's going on?" I didn't sit down right away. I stayed standing for a second. Not because I wanted power in the moment, but because I needed to choose my words carefully. Anger would have been easy. Clarity was harder. "I want to ask you something," I said. "And I'd really prefer an honest answer." Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not lying to you," she replied, a little too quickly. "I didn't say you were," I said quietly. "I just want to understand where you were last night." She held my gaze. "At Emma's. I told you that already." A small pause passed between us. She didn't speak, so I continued, still calm. "But I went by the address that showed up on the delivery receipt. And Emma doesn't live there." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything either of us had said. Patricia looked down at her hands for a moment, then back at me. I could see the thoughts moving behind her eyes, measuring, choosing, deciding what version of the truth she was willing to offer. "You went to that address?" she asked quietly. "I went to understand what was happening in my own marriage," I answered. She exhaled slowly, leaning back against the couch like the air had suddenly grown heavier. "This isn't as simple as you're making it," she said. "I'm not trying to make it simple," I replied. "I'm trying to figure out what's going on." Another pause. Longer this time. She didn't deny anything, but she didn't explain either. And that space between denial and explanation is where the truth usually lives. "I didn't plan for any of this," she said finally. Her voice was softer now, less defensive. "I didn't wake up one day deciding to hurt you." I listened without interrupting, not because it didn't hurt, because I needed to hear the full shape of it. "How long?" I asked quietly. She closed her eyes for a brief second before answering. "A few months." The words landed without noise, but I felt them all the same. Not like a knife, more like confirmation of something my body had already understood before my mind caught up. No more guessing, no more half-truths, just reality, finally spoken out loud. I nodded slowly, absorbing it piece by piece. Strangely, the honesty hurt less than the uncertainty had. "Why didn't you just tell me you were unhappy?" I asked. "We could have tried to fix it, or at least ended it without this." Tears formed in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I was scared," she said. "Scared of breaking everything, scared of being wrong, scared of hurting you." "You hurt me anyway," I said, not harshly, just stating a fact. "I know." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Years of shared life sitting quietly between two people who suddenly didn't know where to put it. "I never wanted to become someone who lies to you," she said. "But somewhere along the way, I already had." I finally sat down in the chair across from her, not close enough to touch, not far enough to pretend we were strangers. She covered her mouth with her hand, breathing unevenly. "I didn't know how to fix it," she whispered. "Neither did I," I said. Silence again. But this time it wasn't sharp, just tired. Two people standing in the quiet ruins of something that used to feel permanent. After a while I spoke, very calmly. "I don't want to deal with it," I said. She looked at me, confused through the tears. Her face broke a little at that. "So that's it?" she asked. "You're leaving?" I stood there for a few seconds after she asked if I was leaving. Not because I didn't know the answer. Because saying it out loud makes things real, in a way silence still protects you from. "Yes," I said finally. "I am." The word didn't sound dramatic. It sounded tired. Like something that had been decided long before this conversation and was only now being spoken. She didn't cry. That surprised me more than anything. For a moment she just sat there, looking at the floor, as if the right sentence might still appear somewhere between us and fix everything retroactively. It didn't. Nothing was coming to save this. I turned and walked into the bedroom. The room looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Bed half made, her sweater on the chair. The quiet, ordinary evidence of a shared life that had stopped being shared without asking permission. I opened the closet and pulled out the small travel bag we used for weekends that never felt long enough. The zipper sounded louder than it should have. Every small noise did. Behind me, I could hear her footsteps in the hallway. Slow, careful, like she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to come closer. She stopped in the doorway. "You don't have to do this today," she said softly. "We can figure it out. Talk more. Take a few days." I folded a shirt and placed it in the bag before answering. "I think we already took too many days," I said. "And they didn't change anything." "That's not fair," she replied, her voice tightening. "You didn't even try to work through this with me." I paused, holding another shirt in my hands. "I would have," I said quietly, "if I'd known we were already losing." She leaned lightly against the doorframe like standing upright required effort now. "I didn't plan for this," she said. "I didn't want it to happen like this." "I know," I answered. And I meant it. Because the worst endings usually aren't planned. They just grow slowly in places no one wants to look. I packed slowly, not because I had much to take, just clothes, a charger, a toothbrush. The basic equipment of someone who no longer lives where his life used to be. It would have been easier if something had been smashed. At least then the ending would match the feeling. When the bag was half full, she spoke again. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Does it matter?" I said gently. "I'll be fine." "That's not what I asked." I zipped a smaller pocket and looked at her. "I'll stay with Daniel for a few days," I said. "Just until I figure things out." She nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer, and still hoped for a different one. Another long pause settled in the room. Years of mornings, dinners, inside jokes, quiet routines, all of it sitting there with nowhere to go. "I never stopped caring about you," she said suddenly. Her voice cracked just enough to sound real. "Even when things were wrong." I rested my hands on the edge of the dresser and let the words land. "I believe you," I said. "That's what makes this harder, not easier." Tears finally filled her eyes, but she wiped them away before they could fall. "I thought I had more time," she whispered. "That's the problem with time," I replied softly. "We always think there's more of it than there is." I closed the bag and pulled the zipper the rest of the way. The sound was final in a quiet, ordinary way. No music, no thunder, just fabric closing. And somehow that felt more honest than any dramatic ending. I picked the bag up and held it for a moment, surprised by how light it was. Funny, how little you actually take with you when you leave an entire life behind. She stepped slightly into the room, as if proximity alone might change my decision. "So that's it?" she asked. "You're really going?" I looked at her, really looked, trying to memorize the face that had once felt like home. "Yeah," I said. "I think this is it." She swallowed, fighting something she didn't know how to name. "I'm sorry," she said. Not loudly, Not theatrically, just honestly. I walked past her into the hallway. She didn't try to stop me, didn't reach for my arm, didn't ask me to stay. Maybe she understood that the moment for asking had already passed. At the door, I put on my shoes slowly, giving the silence one last chance to say something meaningful. It didn't. I picked up my keys and rested my hand on the doorknob. I stood there for a second, looking at the door instead of turning around. I opened the door. Cool air from the hallway slipped inside, carrying the faint smell of someone else's dinner, someone else's normal evening. For a moment, I stayed on the threshold between two versions of my life. Then I added without turning, sometimes one address is enough to understand where you don't live anymore. I stepped out and closed the door gently behind me. Not loud, not angry, just final. A few months passed, no sudden transformation, just time doing what it always does, moving forward whether you're ready or not. At first, everything felt temporary. Daniel's spare room, clothes still in a bag. That strange sensation of living between decisions instead of inside a life. Work helped. Routine helped. Silence helped more than anything, because in silence, things slowly rearrange themselves into something you can carry. I heard about Patricia through mutual friends. She moved out of the apartment a few weeks later, took a smaller place across town, started over in the quiet, practical way adults do when the story they expected doesn't happen. I don't know if she stayed with him, and at some point, I realized I didn't need to know. That was probably the first real sign I was healing. The moment curiosity finally let go. Sometimes I think about that night, about the address. Not with anger, more like you think about an old photograph. Proof that something was real, even if it didn't last. I don't regret loving her, and I don't regret leaving. If you felt this story hit hard, drop a like, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps Steelheart beating.